He's originally from Laie, Hawaii. He's the founding member of and a consultant at 6P Leadership. He's also our director, the Director of Leadership and Organizational Development at the Division of Human Resources Management in the Department of GovOps. He's presented as a keynote speaker across the country. He's consulted with a lot of public and private organizations, including doing management and executive coaching. In fact, he's an ATD certified expert coach. Dr. Chase is on faculty at the Gettysburg Leadership Experience in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He earned an MPA from BYU, emphasizing in OB and HR, and a PhD from the University of Utah with research emphasis on the institutional leadership of Abraham Lincoln. He, his wife, and 3 children live in the Salt Lake Valley. Today, he'll discuss the role of humility in transforming your leadership and your team. Dr. Chase.
That is a really good introduction. Thank you, Rick. I'm like, man, I want to hear from this guy now. Wow. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And let me just say thank you for joining us always for our now monthly off-the-shelf training series. We know you're busy, and we hope that you find value in taking a little time away from all the things that you're doing, all the things that keep you busy, to work on your leadership, to work on your role as a professional just a little bit. I'm going to jump right into this because as those of you that have had training from me before know, I tend to get excited about a topic and I tend to go long-winded. So I'm going to jump right into this and say that we've got a very challenging topic today. I think a really, really important Rick does, what JJ has done when they do their webinars, is they have the very practical steps. Look, here are the things you need to know. Here are the things that you do to apply these skills. Humility is a little trickier than that. I am going to admit right now that we have to go a little bit high level and we have to go a little bit ethereal. So what I'm going to ask you to do as we talk about humility as a foundation to your leadership, and as Rick mentioned, as a foundation to your team and organizational success, I'm going to ask you to think about yourself, but also think about the best leaders that you have known. I think as you do that, this idea of humility, true humility, and these leaders that you have known that you would say, yeah, those are the best leaders I've had, I think you're going to see how they align pretty quickly. So I call humility the elusive virtue. And the reason it's the elusive virtue, the joke is always told about the teacher says, okay, class, who in here is really good at humility? And everybody raises their hand, right? There's this irony about humility is the second that you and I think that we're good at it, we're not. And that's one of the challenges with talking about humility is how do you know, how does someone know that they're good at humility? And in fact, it's one of the things that makes having scientific evidence, social scientific evidence about humility challenging, because you can't really do self-reporting on it. Are you a humble leader? Why, yes, I am. Right? It's hard to get that kind of data. So we want to be very aware. You're going to hear me say a word a lot today, which is that there is a paradox to all of this. There is a paradox to humility in the fact that the more you pursue it, even sometimes the more it gets away from you. So Rick mentioned that I'm originally from Laie, Hawaii, and we had a chance to be out there a week and a half ago. And this is actually a picture from a place on Oahu called Hanauma Bay. Now, my son, my 7-year-old, I've got a 10, 7, and 5-year-old. My 7-year-old has this weird habit. He will chase animals, no matter what. Like if there's birds, I'm going to chase them. I'm going to, And we went to Hanauma Bay, and Hanauma Bay is a serious coral reef where you can do some really nice snorkeling. And he's good at snorkeling. And what he did, these fish are so used to people, they'll just come up to you. Right? They'll kind of just surround you because they're so used to snorkelers. What my son didn't understand is he would always go after them. He'd reach for them and he'd swim towards the fish. And it's only then that the fish would leave, that they'd disperse, that they'd run away from him. Well, humility is the elusive virtue, partly because it's like those fish. It's a little bit like leadership, I think, in general, and we'll talk about this. If the more that I pursue and focus and become obsessed with, well, am I humble or not? The irony is the more that we are likely to not have true humility. But as we stop and as we focus on other things, then we have the opportunity for humility to become part of our DNA, to become a virtue that we possess. And so this is a little bit tricky to talk about in that vein. Three other things I need to mention here as we talk about understanding true humility. Increasingly, as I do leadership development, I believe there is a split between knowing, doing, and being. So much training we do is, hey, here's liability training, right? Don't do these things. Here's the law, managers and other state of Utah employees, that you need to know. Here's the law. Don't do these things. If you know it, you're fine. Then there's a lot of skills-based training that we do. That is simply, if you do these things, if you have these behaviors, then you'll be at, holding one-on-ones, things like that. You'll be doing a good job as a manager. Once we start talking about leadership virtues, really we become interested in being. Who are you as a leader? This becomes much more critical. Now, this relationship between knowing, doing, and being, and of course, being is really where we want to arrive when we start talking about attributes and virtues as leaders. There's a much more complex relationship that we'll examine near the end of our discussion today. But I want you all to consider now that I'm not just interested in you knowing about humility, as important as that is, and even acting humbly. Acting with humility. And the reason that that's important is there are a lot of leaders out there that would manipulate or take advantage of the virtue of humility or any other leadership virtue and say, how can I exploit this so that I'm even more effective? How can I act humbly so people will think I'm humble so I can be an even better leader? And once we start doing that, humility as a virtue simply becomes a commodity. And so we're interested in, you and I, in being actually humble leaders, actually possessing humility. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We sent this to you whenever you signed up. We want to talk about what real humility is and why it's indispensable to modern leadership, especially leadership in 2022, right? Some of the things that we're facing today. And then we'll talk about this interesting dynamic between humility and confidence. And similarly, very similar to that conversation, we'll talk about humility and power. And here's that word I said I was going to say a lot, that paradox of power. And then finally, how this is only valuable to you and I if, despite the elusiveness of this, if you and I can develop authentic humility. So this is what we want to talk about. So St. Augustine, early religious thinker. When I say early, I'm talking 5th century, right? Thinker. This is the most common quote I've seen on humility. Truly, humility is the foundation of all other virtues. Hence, in the soul in which this virtue does not exist, there cannot be any other virtue except in mere appearance. So he's saying, unless you and I truly possess humility, we can't have these other virtues that are good. Now, we're going to come back to this quote, because if we were in a classroom right now, I would say, do you believe St. Augustine here? And if so, why? Why is it that I have to have humility if I'm going to possess any other virtues? I might appear to have them, remember, the doing and the knowing instead of the being, but I won't actually possess those other virtues unless I have humility. So if you want to talk about in the chat, I'd be interested in seeing some of your thoughts. I can't see the chat right now. I'm not paying attention to that, but you guys can see it. Why would that be? Why would it be that I have to have humility if I'm going to possess all the other virtues and virtues that I would want as a leader? By the way, from Owens, Rowett, and Wilkins. By the way, Owens is down at BYU now. He is becoming, quite frankly, the leading thinker, I think, on humility and leadership. They said, thus, in general terms, if we're going to define humility, it's a very hard to define thing. It means to have a grounded view or perspective of oneself and others. Now, listen to this. Here's this balancing act here. Humility entails a deeply held belief in the equal dignity and shared limits of all persons. So not only that all people have and are worthy of our dignity, but that also all people have limits and flaws and foibles and failings, right? It's that understanding. I love this definition from Owens and his colleagues there. Here's the interesting thing about humility. This is from the Wall Street Journal. I got this from a friend and colleague, Lance Olson. As recently as 2018, most of the thinking suggests, still to this day, you guys, most of the thinking suggests leaders should be charismatic, attention-seeking, and persuasive. In other words, we still have this heroic vision of the leaders that are going to go in and transform the organization by sheer dint of their charisma and their intelligence and how persuasive they can be. And yet the Wall Street Journal reports such leaders tend to ruin their companies because they take on more than they can handle. They're overconfident and don't listen to feedback from others. They're not harnessing the power of the collective when we have these heroic visions of leadership. And by the way, this is a finding, not surprising. Many of you have seen this book before. I can't remember. I want to say like mid-90s even. If not, then maybe like 2000. Collins published Good to Great, where he said, look, he said the companies that he studied that had real sustained success did not have the charismatic, dynamic leaders. They had humble leaders, leaders with professional will and real humility that really were the effective leaders that transformed their companies and had sustained success. And so these findings are not new to us. And yet, to be honest with you, our understanding of humility as a leadership virtue is only now in the very nascent early stages of being studied. We've known it's been the purview of philosophy, of psychology for a long time. But as far as organizational studies, we're only now learning to understand more than anecdotally and experientially, but scientifically understand its real impact. Although Collins would say, I demonstrated a long time ago that it was humble leaders that really led their organizations through sustained excellence. Now, one other thing here, as we spend this a few minutes here defining humility and what it is, Marilyn Gist, a professor at University of Seattle and other things, wrote a really good book on humility and leadership. And she said one of the ways we understand and interface with humility and when we sense it is when there's a lack of it. Okay, so humility to her, she says, is an absence of arrogance. And she says, so one of the things is we know when someone lacks humility, we can sense that it's gone. And I really like what she said here. She said, look, when humility is the absence of arrogance, here are some of the things that you and I do that would show a lack of humility. And others would say, I know they don't have it. So as you look at this list here, look, I don't know many leaders that do all of these things, but I must admit that I know that I do some of these things without meaning to some of the time. And I know other leaders that do some of these things some of the time. And she has this really good research on this and says, these are things that actually happen. I don't know that there's a lot of bullying. Unfortunately, it still goes on. That hasn't happened to me a lot. Taking credit for others' work, though, I think can happen quite a bit. And I know that I've made that mistake before without even without doing it intentionally, right? I've not given people credit that they do. I want to add one more to this list really quickly here that can sometimes show a lack of humility. I've seen leaders, insecure leaders, that refuse or insist on being the only ones with access to other leaders. And what I mean by that is they are dead set on, if there is work produced by the group, they say, I will be the one to take this to the CEO, not you, even though you did the bulk of it, even though you were the project lead, because I am your boss and the team lead, I will go and take this. Now, sometimes the CEO may say, look, I want this to come through you, and that's the proper channel. But very often it happens because they feel if they lose that connection to higher status people, they will lose any sort of credibility or leadership authority. And I'm telling you, it's the opposite of that, right? And so Marilyn Gist here, I just love her notion that sometimes we sense humility when there is a lack of it, and it's through behaviors like this, okay? So what I'm about to show you now, I think is probably, if there's nothing else that you take away from our conversation today, I want you to pay attention to, I think what the most robust research says, and we're going to look at these things quite a bit. When there is humility, these following 6 things are present. Okay, so we're still in this defining humility stage. You ready? The very first thing, and I cannot stress this one enough, is simply this: low self-focus. Those that are humble tend to focus on themselves less. Now, there's a quote, one of the more, I told you the St. Augustine quote I see quite often. Another quote that I see pretty often is misattributed to the author C.S. Lewis, right? Chronicles of Narnia, other things. It's my understanding now is that it's actually misattributed to him, but nevertheless, it's still worthwhile. His quote is, or that quote is, that humility is not thinking less of yourself; it's just thinking of yourself less. Well, the social scientific psychological evidence is, yeah, that's absolutely true. Stop obsessing over ourselves. In fact, let me just tell you, one of the things I think that we struggle with in leadership development, and again, I'm asking you guys to think about yourselves for this hour. And so I realize I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth here. But if you and I are really going to be humble, we've got to have that low self-focus. And I think this is true for all leadership development and many virtues and attributes that help you and I become more effective leaders. When I go to a week-long leadership development thing, it is still, if my motives are, how can I become a better leader? How can I become more humble? Because I want to be humble and I want to be that kind of leader. I'm still focused on me. The best thing I can tell aspiring leaders or leaders, experienced leaders who want to get even better is stop focusing on yourself. And all of a sudden humility comes. Remember I told you about those fish at Hanama Bay? Sit there, focus on other things, and the fish come. Humility and even leadership is a little bit like that. It doesn't mean that you can't ever be introspective and self-aware. There's a little bit of that. But right now in our world, we are in a me, self-absorbed. We're becoming a self-absorbed society, and leadership development is following that. So what should you be focused on if there's low self-focus? Guys, this is simple. It's others. As a leader, there are those, whether it's customers or whether it's employees or others in the organization or other stakeholders, that you have a stewardship for. Focus on them and focus on whatever purpose you're trying to accomplish. As that becomes a more intensive part of your focus, as there's low self-focus, all of a sudden humility comes to you. It becomes a part of who you are, right? That I cannot overstate this enough. So that low self-focus is absolutely critical. Next is an accurate self-assessment. Humility comes from knowing what your actual strengths and weaknesses are. And we'll talk a little bit later about how, and it's pretty obvious, right? But having an accurate self-assessment, we all have strengths, we all have shortcomings. That's what makes the world interesting. That's what makes the collective powerful. You have to know that you do have strengths, and you have experiences and perspectives that are good and valuable, and also you have shortcomings, right? Related to that is are you willing to acknowledge when you have mistakes and limitations, right? That's part of that accurate self-assessment. Are you open to the idea that others have equally valid viewpoints, that their ideas, even if they have less experience, less education, whatever it might be, or you think they're dead wrong, are you open to considering? Are you willing to say, there have been times in my life, go back to acknowledgement of one's mistakes and limitations, I've been wrong. So even though I think I've got the right answer here, I am willing to hear other perspectives, okay? Keeping your abilities and accomplishments in perspective. There is this tendency we have, it's a social psychological phenomenon called the self-serving bias. And what that is, when something goes wrong, we're not successful, it's because of external conditions. When something goes right, it's because we're awesome. The whole reason I got that job was not for these other variables. The whole reason that this project was a success is because I really made it happen, right? We have this self-serving bias. So keeping your abilities and your accomplishments in perspective in the grand scheme of things is a demonstration of humility. And then finally, I think maybe second in importance, if we want to say that, to low self-focus is appreciating the value of all things, including other people. Recognizing that all people are worthy of dignity, that they are worthy of our respect. And this includes you, right? This includes you. So these 6 things, you're going to see this again. We're going to come back to this. But to me, the most robust research Tangney, Owens, who I mentioned earlier. As I said, this is you see these things over and over and over again. This is what the research says humility is. Okay, so let me go now to why humility is so important. Now, I said earlier that this is a really still very early construct as far as a lot of research. We've known it philosophically and psychologically for some time, but for organizations, it's still very new. However, as much as I might think humility is an important virtue, unless I can tell you it leads to better organizational outcomes, better services for our clients, better experiences for our employees, I'm not sure it's virtuous. In other words, if you and I being humble and possessing humility actually meant that our organizations were crappier, or that your team or your organization would actually benefit from you being arrogant and demanding and brash, well, then those would be the virtues, because it would lead to better outcomes. The good news is there is good evidence that humility and humble leadership leads to the following outcomes. We see better team performance because you have people feeling involved in the team, and when their opinions matter, they feel like their opinions matter, right? And they feel like they can give their complementary strengths to the team. We see better. Think about this, you guys. I get asked all the time now about, Dan, what do we do about the Great Resignation? I mean, in the state, out of the state. People say, what's the antidote for the Great Resignation? Well, there's really good evidence that humble leadership leads to better employee retention. How about that as one of the solutions for the Great Resignation, right? Follower empowerment. We'll talk more about this, but of course, you see already, it makes intuitive sense to us that the humble leaders empower others, give them decision-making authority, seek out opinions and advice and counsel, and expertise, so that you feel and actually are empowered. It leads to better organizational learning because leaders, you are setting the example saying, I don't have all the answers. Let's go look for some answers here, right? So the organizations as a whole tend to learn better. And then finally, and understandably, more comprehensive decision-making, because leaders that are genuinely, not as a gimmick, but who are authentically and genuinely humble, bring others in appropriately to make decisions. They bring in the right parties to help make decisions. So here's the good news. Here's kind of the bottom line. This is virtuous from an organization. Humility is a virtue from an organizational leadership perspective because we know it leads to better outcomes. Could your agencies right now, as you look at this, could it benefit from these things? I'm willing to say yes. I'm willing to say that all of our organizations could use more of this, right? So that's a quick and dirty definition of what humility is and why it's indispensable right now to modern leadership. I want to talk quickly about this surprising relationship between humility and confidence. And let me tell you why this is surprising. Because most people falsely treat these as opposites, as antonyms. And I will tell you that humility and confidence is from an early age, and I'm talking like teenage years. Before I knew I was interested in leadership as a field of study and as a profession, I was interested in it, if that makes sense. And I, without knowing it, the people that I admired, the leaders that resonated with me, who got to me, who got the best out of me, I noticed they possessed this humility about them, and yet they didn't lack confidence. So this became a very kind of early mantra for me in high school, that I was like, yeah, it's humility and confidence. That these aren't mutually exclusive. And yes, Pete, humility doesn't mean being milquetoast, right? It doesn't necessarily mean meekness or a shrinking violet, right? So let's talk about this. Here's the mistake that we make so often as we think about humility and confidence. The first I want to talk about is we make the mistake of equating humility with insecurity. And what I mean by that is this. We see someone who is insecure, or maybe I keep using the word milquetoast, right? Too deferential, and we say, wow, they're really humble. Not necessarily, because I will tell you, I am one of the most, and I mean being honest here, I'm one of the most insecure people that I know. Insecure is not the same as being humble. Okay, insecure comes from a lack of of confidence, a lack of feeling of self-worth. Sometimes it can come even from an arrogance. And when that arrogance gets sort of betrayed or whatever, then insecurity comes out. And I'm not a practicing psychologist, right? But humility and insecurity is the counterfeit to humility. Okay, it is the counterfeit. Just because someone is insecure or any of these other terms we're using doesn't mean they have humility. Okay, then we've got confidence and arrogance. By the way, these are mirrors, and we falsely hold these things up to each other and say they're the same thing. So someone who is very arrogant very often was like, whew, wow, she is not lacking for confidence. Whew, wow, that guy doesn't need any more confidence, when they're arrogant, right? And confidence, real confidence, is not arrogance. It is not this I am better than everybody else kind of attitude. And yet again, we often make the mistake of conflating the two or treating them as if they were synonymous. They are not, right? And in fact, here's again this paradox that we're talking about. Very often, think about this for a second. Think of those that you have known that are arrogant. Very often, it comes from a deep-rooted insecurity. They're not willing to be humble, or they're not willing to allow others to succeed or flourish or to get the spotlight because there is this insecurity about them. And so it's really arrogance and insecurity are really more aligned rather than arrogance and confidence or insecurity and humility. So it's humility and confidence that are actually these partner virtues. And as we look at humility, as we really understand what humility is, we see that confidence is a part of this, and real confidence has a humility to it. Well, why is it? This is from the University of South Florida, and I vetted this definition because I wasn't in love with the source, but so I went to one of my best friends who's a clinical psychologist. I said, hey, are you good with this definition? He's like, yeah, that's good. That's good. I'm like, okay, that makes me feel better about it. But it's a trust in your abilities and a sense of controlling your life. Look at this. You know your strengths and your weaknesses, right? And that you can handle criticism. People with real confidence are also humble enough to get feedback, right? An arrogant person doesn't accept feedback well. The insecure person struggles when they get feedback because it can derail them. And so again, in this definition, you see this balance between, even in the definition itself of self-confidence, there is that level of humility. Now, I love this from Kim Cameron and Spreitzer study they did in 2012. Look, humility, someone said meekness earlier, and humility doesn't equate to weakness either, right? But it requires, I love this, a unique sort of courage. So if you and I are going to really have humility, that unique sort of courage to me is true, genuine self-confidence. You got to be confident. Okay, Brene Brown right now, as popular a speaker and thinker on leadership as there is, has popularized this notion of vulnerability. You have to have real confidence to have vulnerability, right? If you're going to help others and improve yourself, that takes real confidence. Right, but it also takes a humility to know that you have things that need to be improved, right? So think about this for a second. Humility and confidence both require all of those things that we talked about earlier. If I'm going to have an accurate self-assessment, I need that is to know what I'm truly strong and weak at, and then I could improve on. For example, takes genuine confidence, be like, I'm still a good person. I still have value, right? I still have value, even though I have shortcomings. Just like other people still have value and they're worthy of dignity, even though they have shortcomings and they're not perfect at everything. And so you see here, again, this whole definition of humility, as I look at this list and say, yeah, it takes actual genuine confidence to have all those things. And that's why, and that's why, let me share with you one more definition. Daniel Goleman, who's the guy who made who made emotional intelligence really into the public consciousness, who put it there. He said, look, let me tell you what self-confidence is. It's a strong sense of self-worth and capabilities. In other words, you know that you have worth even though you have shortcomings. But to have a positive impact, self-confidence must be aligned with reality. Arrogance is just this delusion. Arrogance is I'm good at everything. I'm the best, right? Self-confidence is aligned with reality. And so a lack of self-awareness is an obstacle to realistic self-confidence, and I would say is an obstacle to humility. To be able to have a low self-focus, look at that top one, and look at the bottom one. To appreciate the value of all things, including other people, including yourself, requires both confidence and humility. Okay, so we see those how they're aligned here. Let me give you one quick last thing here about humility and confidence. The Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, this is going to seem like a weird example to you, so stay with me. This is a learning theory, and it's really quite interesting. But when someone learns knowledge about something, by the way, think teenagers here for a second. If you look at the top of the graph, right here is you learn a little knowledge about something. You've heard the phrase, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Dunning-Kruger says, the second I get a little bit of knowledge, you say, I know everything. Now, this is from a foundation repair. You guys, I'm not even sure I know what foundation repair is. Okay. But I loved it because every profession has started using Dunning-Kruger, and I just found one with foundation repair that I liked. But they say you get a little bit of knowledge, someone new to foundation repair, for example, they say, you know what, I know everything about this now. And then as you start to, your experience increases, look at that, as experience goes up, you say, oh my gosh, I'm getting a reality check here. I don't know that much anymore. And then you start to get a little bit insecure, okay? But look at, ultimately, as our experience goes up and our confidence goes up, as we really start to gain more knowledge, look who is confident here, but also the most humble. The real expert with all the experience possesses, I love the phrasing here, I understand that I don't know everything, humility. I understand that I don't know everything, but I'm confident that I have the tools that I need to get the correct answers. The professionals that I know in any industry, in any field, the experts I know possess both this confidence, like, oh yeah, you can come and talk to me about that, but also a humility. They're the ones to say, oh my gosh, you know who you need to, I know a little bit about this. Here's my field. You know who you need to go talk to about that? Or, oh man, this is really hard to understand. No one knows everything about it. This is another indication. This Dunning-Kruger effect is another example of how this symmetry between humility and confidence. Okay, really interesting. By the way, look up more about the Dunning-Kruger effect. Although a lot of you were already familiar with it, I'm quite sure. Now, so we've talked about what humility is, why it's indispensable to modern leadership. And then we've talked about this relationship between humility and confidence. I want to talk about humility and the paradox of power. And I want to bring on Jenny Reese. Are you on?
I am.
Okay. Jenny, I've asked Jenny Reese to join us to share a few thoughts on this. And I told her I was going to do this. One of the reasons I asked Jenny Reese to do this is Jenny Reese, for those of you that don't know, is the executive director on the governor's cabinet for the Department of Government Operations. And let me tell you my distance from Jenny here. So my boss has a boss who reports to Jenny. So it's not like Jenny and I are hanging out all the time. And well, of course she's treated me a certain way because we're peers and that sort of thing. But I will admit that I was immediately struck by interactions with Jenny that there was very little arrogance. There wasn't this need to sort of be like, by the way, I'm Director Reese and you're a peon. Yeah, there was none of that, right? So I thought about Jenny when I thought about this paradox of power and humility and power and the importance of humility to leadership. Now, she and I have not rehearsed anything here, but Jenny, would you speak to us about your experience with power and leadership and humility and those kinds of themes?
Sure. And when Dan and I spoke just briefly yesterday when he was introducing the topic to me, I told him this feels like an uncomfortable topic because it feels like if you're talking about it, that means you can't possibly have it, right? This particular role that I'm in now, it's been a wonderful experience for me, but also a steep learning curve. And so it was really made known to me early on that in order to help my team be successful, I would need to spend at least the first year here in a learner mindset and learning from the people who are doing the jobs every day and the boots on the ground and who know how to do this job well and where opportunities for improvement are. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to create an environment where employees felt that it was safe to express opinions. It was safe to express differences of opinion, because I am a firm believer that we'll make better decisions and we'll have better outcomes if we create and encourage an environment where people aren't afraid to speak up and share their expertise and share their knowledge. Somebody in the comments said something about how it's impossible for one person to know everything, and I definitely agree with that. And one thing that was really interesting to me when I first started in this role, we were consolidating 3 agencies into one, and so we were having weekly town halls in order to share information and to hear concerns. And there were a lot of things I didn't know, and so I just said, I don't know the answer to that. And I was really surprised how many people would email me afterward and say how surprised they were to hear a leader say, I don't know the answer to that. They expect that maybe things will just be made up, and that they appreciated that I was okay just acknowledging I didn't know. So it's been a fun experience kind of being thrown into a role where I was the person who knew the least out of everybody on the team. And so it was really important for me to just go into that learner mentality.
Have you, Jenny, thank you. Have you seen, so you've seen the good response from organizational members when you didn't try and fake expertise or try and put on this front of I know everything and hubris and that sort of thing? Am I getting that right, that the response has been positive rather than people saying, well, why are you the boss if you don't know the answer? Is that a fair assessment?
It is. And like I said, it was surprising to me how many people saw that as a strength for me to say, I don't know. They actually liked that approach and saw that as not a bad thing. But yes, the reaction has been very positive.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you, Jenny. I really appreciate that. And I think you've articulated that perfectly. And so thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. By the way, let me just say too, I'd kind of forgotten about this, but when I keep wanting to call her Director Reese, and she told me not to call her that.
Call me Jenny.
When Jenny said that, this is so true. Guys, think about this for a second. The insecure leader, not the humble leader, the insecure / arrogant leader will go and say, okay, I need to put on this front that I have all the answers and that I'm all knowing, all powerful, that sort of thing. And I have no flaws. We've worked with a lot of leaders that they try and put on this air of infallibility. Here's the problem. Here's what tends to happen. Everyone knows that we all have flaws. If you are unwilling to be humble, this is especially, I think, true of new leaders, but if you're unwilling to be humble, the natural reaction for the people you are trying to lead when you say, nope, I don't have any flaws, yep, I've got all the answers, is then they go proactively and say, oh yeah, we're going to show you that you don't know everything, and we're going to show you that you have flaws. And by the way, it just, to Jenny's point, it just comes across as insecure. They know. It does not come across as, don't worry, I'm confident, we'll get there. It comes across as insecure and false. And so I love that point that she made there. That is so much a part of this humility and the paradox of power. Okay. By the way, so some of you, we'll go over this quickly, but some of you have read the book, or some of you have heard this quote from Lord Acton, right? Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There are a couple of paradoxes, if that's the right way to say it, a couple of paradoxes of power. One, by the way, I read this really, really fascinating book by Brian Klaus. He's an American, but he did his doctoral work in Oxford, and now he teaches in London on who gets power and how it changes. Really fascinating book. Okay, but here are some of the findings. That, to be honest with you, one of the paradoxes of power is that you and I are not good at how we deal with power. So the obvious thing is that power corrupts. Lord Acton, right, this maybe most famous phrase on power says, yeah, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Brian Klaus says, yeah, power can corrupt. That's a problem. Power can corrupt us. He said, but there are some other problems. Very often those who seek power are the least suited to have it. And he said, now look, he gives some political examples, national examples, right? But he also says this happens in organizations too. Here's the paradox. Those that say, I should be the boss, are very often the ones that lack humility and are pursuing power for the wrong reasons. And the problem is, look at the third bullet point there. Quite frankly, even in modern organizations today, we are bad at giving power to the right people. We tend to give it to those who say, I'm the best, I'm the smartest, give it to me. They come across well often in short interactions, i.e. interviews. And I will just tell you, this is a failing of HR, quite frankly, and organizations. And I mean all organizations. I'm not just talking about DHR, but all hiring and promoting practices. We very often promote those people that are the least suited to hold it. And so our systems are bad. Brian Claw's research says that often we're not good at this. So that's one of the paradoxes of power here. We should be promoting, kind of counterintuitively, paradoxically, those that are saying, you know what, I've got confidence. I could do this, but lots of people could. Right? We don't often promote those people. Here's another thing. Jenny Reese was speaking about this. Look at Kouzes and Posner here. Leaders accept and act on the paradox of power, and that is that you become more powerful when you give your own power away. Now, I want to talk about this because that sounds a little bit like fortune cookie wisdom, right? Where it's like, oh, the more power you give away, the more power you have. Like, I could read that, in a fortune cookie or something. But let's talk about why this is true, because we see this over and over in modern, that's the important key there, modern organizational leadership studies, that actually, as the power you keep, as you distribute and empower others, the power you have goes up. Well, how is that? Why is that? Think about it for a second. When we talk about empowering others, or when we talk about the power you have as a leader, generally you're given authority, formal authority from an organization. As you distribute that downward, you're usually giving decision-making authority and autonomy to those that you are leading. The reason the power you have goes up is because people want from their jobs, they want autonomy. We know from Daniel Pink and other thinkers, they want mastery. They want decision-making authority over how their job gets done. They want to be treated like professionals, like adults who know how to get the work done. And so the power you have increases as you have distributed this decision-making or formal authority downward, because you now have people saying, I'm going to give you power, leader, because I'm going to give you my discretionary effort. I'm going to stay committed to the organization. I'm not going to turn over, even though it's the great resignation, and even though I could get $1 or $2 more an hour somewhere else. There's a million jobs out there. I'm going to stick around and give you my engagement and my commitment. And so the actual power, not in a sort of dictatorial way, but the actual power you have increases. Let me give you a really sort of practical example of what Kouzes and Posner are talking about here when this paradox of power, how the power you keep goes down, the power you have goes up. Let's look at this from a decision-making perspective. And look at that quote there, right? For Carl Weick, who's organizational psychologist, he's retired now, but was one of the leading thinkers in organizational psychology. It's not a sign of a weakness for a leader to say, I don't know. I don't know the answer, right? To Jenny's point. But to get others involved in making decisions. So stay with me here. On our axis here, big picture information on that left axis is usually possessed by senior leaders. They have all the information. We'll just use the state as an example here. They're interacting with the governor's office. They are dealing with the legislature more regularly. Look at the bottom axis there. Market conditions and street level knowledge. Who usually has that? Who usually is closer and has a better understanding of how actual services are delivered and the experiences of the clients that are the recipients of the services we're trying to provide? Generally speaking, that is frontline employees, okay? The problem is, too often, look in the top left quadrant there, too often decisions are made at low understanding of market conditions with lots of big picture information. A lot of decisions are made there by executive leadership. Now, if you look at the bottom left quadrant, decisions should never be made there. If you have no big picture information, you have no understanding how clients are actually receiving your services, nothing should ever happen there. Now, look at the bottom right. It is not empowering to give decision-making authority to those on the front lines who have high knowledge of the market conditions or street level conditions. It's not empowering to give them decision-making authority with no high-level, big-picture information about what we're ultimately trying to accomplish as an organization. So what you want You want decision making to take place, and this is distributed power, where there is high knowledge of street level conditions, market conditions, and big picture information. That requires lots of communication. That requires senior leaders saying, I don't know. What information do you have? People that I'm trying to lead, people who don't have the same title I do. And by the way, let me just say something else here. It also takes humility for the street level employee, the frontline employee, to on occasion say, I don't have big picture information. So maybe sometimes when decisions are made above me, do I have enough humility to say, I don't agree with their decision that they're making in the executive suite? I don't agree with it, but if I'm being humble, I must admit that I don't have all the information, the big picture information and data that they have. Okay, this slide, what we're talking about right now, is the most frustrating to me that we're not in a live classroom, because I would love to get confirmation that this makes sense about humility and the paradox of power. Because to me, you see it here. What we talked about here, the power you keep goes down, the power you have goes up. This is a practical example of how that would happen. The more effective decisions you make, the better direction taking, Carl White calls it here, really better decision making happens when the power that you keep goes down, that power that you have goes up because you're making better decisions. Okay. Now, so we've talked about real humility. We've talked about confidence and humility. Jenny just instructed us on this paradox of power, right? The last thing we need to talk about, and the only way that this is useful, it'd be very unfortunate if right now I said, good news, bad news, guys. Humility is really important, but you either have it or you don't. That would be kind of disappointing. The good news is the humility, although it's elusive, although it's like those fish that maybe you can't chase, there are things that you and I can do to help us become more effective and more humble authentically, right? By the way, again, Owens, you see that name again, Bradley Owens out there at BYU now. This is the good news. Overall, there's a high level of consensus that humility and leadership could be developed. It's not a static trait, right? And that leader humility would positively influence performance. So in other words, you and I can become more humble. And as leaders, as we become more humble, we tend to see better performance. That's the good news, right? So let's talk about this. I remember I talked about knowing, doing, and being, and I said some trainings, like required training that you guys have to take, we're interested in knowing. Then maybe skills-based training, we're just simply interested in the doing. What we're interested in our conversation today is you and I as leaders being. Is humility a part of our DNA? Is that a virtue that we actually possess? Well, let me tell you, and I said it's a little more complex than that. And here's what I mean by that. So this is what we call the virtue or attribute development cycle. Knowing, doing, and being aren't separate constructs. And in fact, if you and I want to develop humility, here's the good news. There are things that we can understand, everything we've talked about today, increasing our knowledge about humility and its value as a leadership attribute is increasing our knowledge and our understanding of what is right and good. Then next, that leads us to do certain things. Now, the reason it says there in parentheses, pure motivations, if I'm doing humble actions for the sake of manipulating people into thinking I'm actually humble when I don't care about them, when I don't see their value and their inherent worth, well, then that's a problem. But if I do things because I really do genuinely want to possess more humility, and I do genuinely want to become an effective leader, the interesting thing is that in the doing, some of the behaviors, the humble behaviors, can help me actually start to internalize humility, and it becomes part of my DNA. That's the good news, right? That's the good news. So here's our knowing, doing, and being. This is how we develop humility. So I have an understanding of humility as a leadership virtue, right? And I understand the definition. Then I need to recognize that humility has impacts on organizational outcomes. And then the other thing that I can increase my knowing is an acute awareness of myself and others. Well, what about the doing? Here are some specific things that if our motivations, our being is good, some things that you and I can do to start demonstrating humility. And then hopefully, as we do it authentically and with the right motivations, it becomes a part of who we are. Recognize and acknowledge others' efforts and abilities. And what I'm talking about here, everyone, is consciously saying, I need to give more credit to other people. When there are shortcomings and failings, I need to take responsibility, and I need to actually sit and think like, okay, how was I a part of this? In fact, I spent some time with a group, not in the state of Utah, in the past 2 weeks. It's really remarkable. There is some dysfunction in this team, right? And it's not a big team. There's some dysfunction. And part of it is this team, the members are all very quick to point out that other people need the things that we're talking about. You see the irony in that? They're all willing to say, yeah, they need to get better at this. When a really humble leaders are the ones that be like, whoa, what is my contribution to the dysfunction that we're experiencing as a team here? Another thing that you could do is start this seems trite, but start genuinely listening to people, not as gimmick, but listening to learn and to understand. I want to learn something by listening to this employee right now. I want to learn something, and I want to understand where they're really coming from, and then get a coaching and development focus. If you can put your focus on how can I make those around me better, then humility starts to become part of our DNA. Remember those displays of arrogance that Marilyn Gist that we talked about earlier? It's holding ourselves accountable for some egocentric displays, those arrogant displays of behavior, and saying, whoa, did I just take credit for my team's work? Even not entirely, but to a degree I shouldn't have. Did I just play kind of like the title card on someone? Did I start treating my employees' time as if it were less valuable than my own because I'm the big boss and I'm super busy? Guard against those egocentric behaviors and displays. And then finally, I can't say this enough, but this focus on others. This might be the most important thing. So remember, knowing, which we're doing here, and doing, if you're doing it with the right motivations, can lead to this being on the right side there, where you actually appreciate and have an internalized the inherent worth of other people. And you're connected to a purpose, something that is bigger than yourself. That's where we're going. And I'm pointing to my screen here, like we're in a live training and no one can see what I'm pointing to. But anyway, so again, this is it. This developing humility in kind of a nutshell is that can you be more focused on others? Can you be more focused on some higher purpose, whatever your division, agencies are trying to accomplish? And in fact, I'll tell you, maybe the best thing I could tell you, if you want to become a better leader, stop worrying about you, capital Y-O-U, you becoming a better leader. Because that is self-absorption. That is solipsism. That is self-focus. Instead, you will become humble. You will become a better leader as you worry about others. I saw one of the chat things came up quickly, and someone mentioned servant leadership. Yeah, for sure. Servant leadership is a big part of that. So is transformational leadership. This idea of worry about what it is that your agency is trying to accomplish, the clients that you're trying to serve, as well as the employees that you have. And all of a sudden, this humility will become a part of your DNA. So there you see in the doing. The last thing I will tell you, so there's this knowing, this doing, and then this being. Can you and I actually become humble leaders? Here it is. If you and I are in a classroom right now, this is where we would conclude. Okay? This is where we would conclude. I would say, and I would sit, you and I would be sitting down, 30 of us or so, and I would say, okay, you guys, if I told you earlier that this is where the most research says this is what humility is, I would say, if we're trying to develop humility, what actions do you and I have to take so that there's less self-focus? What actions do we have to take so that we have an accurate self-assessment? And right now, you'd all be raising your hands. You'd be saying, getting feedback from others. You're saying that's how I get an accurate self-assessment. Okay, what do we have to do to acknowledge our own mistakes and limitations? Some sort of self-reflection, writing some of our mistakes and challenges down, things of that nature. Okay, how can you show more openness to others' ideas and viewpoints? Are you actually taking time to explore other people's viewpoints and ideas, right? What could you do to keep your own abilities and accomplishments in perspective? And finally, again, I think, if we want to say that the second most important, appreciating the value of all things, including other people, and you are included in that. You are included in that. So remember this interesting dynamic with power and humility, this interesting dynamic between confidence and humility, and how they are interlocked, they are integrated, right? They are not distinctive, and they certainly aren't antonyms as we sometimes treat them, okay? So here are the 4 things that we've talked about today. Now, here's the good news going forward. We've gone through this. I know this feels like a long hour to you, but we've gone through this pretty quickly. The next off-the-shelf series, I think, is going to be an extension of what we've talked about today, which is about delegation. We've got a lot of managers that talk about, how do I delegate better? Well, only managers with humility, only leaders with humility are interested in delegating appropriately to others. Talking about that paradox of power. Well, delegation is a big part of that. So JJ Acker next month on June 15th is going to talk to us about how, as leaders, we delegate effectively, how we empower others through delegation. So make sure you join us for that. Thank you, everybody, for making the time. You and I can become more humble. We can develop humility. It is paradoxical. It's slippery. It's almost ironic. But the less we focus on ourselves, the more that humility becomes a real part of our DNA. And that's the good news. And we need, now as much as any point I can imagine, we need humility in our organizations. We need humble leaders. So I'll stick around if people have questions or anything else. But thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much.